Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
I'm Stephen Carroll, and this is Here's Why, where we take one news story and explain it in just a few minutes with our experts here at Bloomberg.
We are tariffing all the de minimis imports. We are going to set a level, and it will be a global level.
The administration is doing away with de minimis, which also I think will impact small companies much more dramatically than the large ones. So it will be a very challenging environment.
Unless we have clarity in this question, we will have to suspend the shipment of goods via the postal networks from Germany into the US.
By name, it might be a small matter, but in reality, it's a huge change for American consumers and those who sell goods to them from abroad. As part of his reshaping of global trade, US President Donald Trump has closed what was known as the de minimis exception. That allowed packages worth less than $800 to be shipped into the US without filling out customs paperwork or paying duties. 4 million of these parcels used to enter the US every day, and the effects of closing the loophole are being felt far from America's borders. Postal services in Europe and elsewhere have suspended parcel deliveries to the US as they try to figure out how to adapt. So here's why a big tariff problem comes in small packages. Bloomberg's Trade Tsar Brendan Murray joins me now for more. Brendan, first of all, what was the history of the de minimis exception in the US?
The history dates back to the 1930s when it was a big nuisance for the government to try to process goods that were coming into the country. So they just made the de minimis exception very low. It was around $1, and it stayed that way for many decades until about the 1990s. With the onset of e-commerce, the government saw it less of a nuisance and more of an opportunity.
Okay, so that threshold then raised as far as $800 before it was abolished. What sort of effect does this change, this abolition of this exemption mean? What kind of businesses are most affected by it?
Well, this loophole that's existed for many years now became so wide that something like 1.3 billion packages were coming into the U.S. every year. These are smaller items. Their value, as we've said, had to be under $800. And there was just a lot of them, and they were very hard to process for the customs agency. Many of them came through the mail, and many of them were from merchants that were some small businesses, but others, were the big e-commerce companies like Shein and Temu from China that really led to a flood of these goods coming in, and it no longer was an opportunity. It became a threat to the American economy.
Yeah, indeed, and that's certainly how Donald Trump has framed this change as well. We were warned that this was coming quite a few months ago now. We've talked about the disruption from European postal services as a result of this. Why haven't delivery services been better prepared for this?
Well, like a lot of things that President Trump has done in his second term, this came very quickly. Even a couple months isn't enough time for dozens and dozens of postal services around the world to sync their systems up with the U.S. Customs Agency to be able to meet the requirements. Some of those requirements mean that the tariff on the item has to be paid by the sender. So if you go into a post office in Sweden and you want to send something that's over $100 to someone in the U.S., you now have to fill out the paperwork that declares what that item is, and you have to pay the tariff for it there. And that postal service has to transmit that transaction to the U.S. agency for it to be legitimate and it can go ahead. And what those postal services have said is, we don't have the mechanism set up to do that now, and therefore we're suspending the packages that would qualify now to the U.S., which is, has the potential to lead to a lot of piling up of goods that otherwise would be flowing into the U.S.
And it could potentially have huge damages to all the businesses that are selling, smaller and lower value packages to consumers in the US. What does the new normal look like, both for the shoppers in the US who are trying to buy things from abroad, but also for all these companies that are used to shipping there?
Well, it depends on how long it takes for the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency to get these systems up and running. They have brought on board some companies that deal with these kinds of transactions, private individual vendors who can do this for them, but it's nowhere near the amount of help that's going to be necessary to deal with these something like 4 million packages a day on average. So it could be weeks or even months before we see the flow of these goods returning to any kind of way that looks normal. But that doesn't do anything to eliminate the paperwork that's necessary and the cost of the tariff that has to be paid. So what we're going to see, and you'll see companies in the U.S. that will be welcoming this. The Main Street shops that would want to sell, say, yarn, don't have that competition anymore from overseas. So there are some benefits to this, to the U.S. economy, according to the Trump administration, but there'll be a lot of hiccups along the way.
Of course, it's not just the US that has this sort of exemption for small packages as well. Are other countries looking to make similar changes? So
the US's $800 de minimis is very generous by international standards. It's something like 150 euros in the euro area. I think it's around 30 Canadian dollars for Canada. And countries are looking at this and saying, maybe this is, number one, a way to raise revenue like the US is raising. And number two, what happens when all of these cheap goods made in, say, China start flowing in our direction? What's that going to do to our Main Street businesses? You've seen some grumblings here in the UK that say this is a threat to the high street boutiques, that if these goods are allowed to flood into the UK, there could be some threats to local businesses. So there has been some pushback by countries that are saying, de minimis had its day, but maybe it's time we end it and bring all this under the scrutiny of the Customs and Border Patrol agencies that protect countries from the abuse of the system.
Thinking more broadly about this, is this the end of easy international shopping online?
It's probably not the end of easy international shipping, but it's probably the start of a period where it's not so cheap and easy and accessible anymore. A lot of those goods that would have come through under de minimis, i.e. no tariff attached to it, they came via airplanes, via air cargo, which is a very expensive way to move goods. But the calculation now might not work to send it via air cargo, and they're going to shift to ocean cargo. Ocean cargo is obviously much slower. It's cheaper, but it will take 3 weeks to make it across the Pacific from Asia to the U.S. or Asia to Europe, rather than 10 hours on an airplane. So this could be the beginning of the end of cheap and fast items delivered to your doorstep. It's going to go slower and it's going to cost you more.
Okay, well, people will be watching out for that with interest, I'm sure. Brendan Murray, our Trade Tsar, thank you very much. For more explanations like this from our team of 3,000 journalists and analysts around the world, go to bloomberg.com/explainers. I'm Stephen Carroll. This is Here's Why. I'll be back next week with more. Thanks for listening.